Thank you all for coming. My name is Matt Lemon, and I'm excited to talk to you about my thesis research. In May, I'll graduate from NC State with a master's in graphic design, and my thesis work, in part, examines the intersection of psychology, metaphor, and VR games as it relates to cancer. This presentation is a summary of my primary research question. And by the end, I hope you will have a better idea of how to answer this question. How can the design of a serious VR game use multimodal metaphors to transform a patient's embodied metaphorical conceptualization of their cancer from a negative source of anxiety and depression to a positive opportunity for personal growth? I love those research questions, how you need a thesaurus to decode it. Okay, so I'm excited to show you some of my VR concepts. Before I do that, I feel like we should give a little background to cancer. 38.4% of people in the US will receive a cancer diagnosis in their lifetime. Seems like a lot. And perhaps you find this surprising, or maybe you can relate with it. But those facing a life-threatening illness are likely to experience psychological distress, which are negative emotions that impede everyday activity. Cancer-related psychological distress is distinguished as a patient's negative emotional response to a cancer diagnosis, and it includes 4 attributes: depression, anxiety, fear, and feeling discouraged. Patients also have a warped sense. Patients who experience psychological distress also have a warped sense of their self and their circumstances. Cancer-related psychological distress has some serious consequences. To name a few, depressed survivors are 2 times as likely to die prematurely, and suicide is twice as likely for survivors. Mental activity affects behavior, and behavior can negatively influence the cell's ability to self-destruct, which is known as apoptosis, and the rate of mutation, immunity, and cancer's growth rate. But it should be noted that the National Cancer Institute is reluctant to agree with this growing body of evidence. But they do somewhat agree when they say, while the NCI says there is no evidence that successful management of psychological stress improves cancer survival, they do go on to acknowledge that experimental research suggests that tumors' ability to grow and spread can be encouraged by psychological stress. So there's a tension here in academia and in medicine of whether or not and how much our minds can affect cancer's ability to grow, and specifically a stressed mind. And so that is prime opportunity for research. So cancer is, at least in part, an unknown entity beyond the understanding of even our greatest minds, and buried in the essential elements of our biology. And as a result, must be undertaken with a broad range of experts beyond traditional medicine. Of course, there are other sources. Fearing the unknown future is a source of distress for cancer patients. And of course, there are other sources of distress: the cost, unwelcome changes to your body, and having to make immediate decisions that have lasting consequences. But really, all of these sources of distress point back to the fear of cancer and its unknown consequences for our future. In concert with treatment and counseling and family support, metaphors are one solution to the problem of cancer-related psychological distress, as well as VR, but I'll get to that in a moment. They help make sense of one's experience with cancer. Additionally, VR games, and all forms of games really for that matter, are inherently metaphorical because the user plays as a character and gains said character's abilities. As Kiermaier, an academic who studies metaphor in medicine, put it, healing may not occur because the metaphorization of distress gives the person room to maneuver. Healing may occur because the metaphorization of distress gives the person room to maneuver, imaginative possibilities, behavioral options, and rhetorical supply. Perhaps you agree with my observation that some of these points can translate to virtual environments. For example, the person's room to maneuver, or imaginative possibilities, behavioral options. My investigation has identified these 7 values of metaphor for cancer patients: shielding, playful, communal, bodily experience, educational. It allows for control and provides perspective. And I'll give you some examples of people that are doing this and ways that I think they can improve. But first, we got to get through some of these definitions. So conceptual metaphor theory posits that our brain maps the source and target domains of an entity or action to understand the world better. And that's Lakoff and Johnson. So the basics of conceptual metaphor theory are you have a known target, fighting, which I'm sure you all are familiar with this metaphor. We hear it constantly. They lost their battle with cancer. They beat cancer. They succumbed to cancer. It's a very common metaphor that goes back a while. But we know what fighting is. We don't know what cancer is. And so we call cancer as a fight because we have a known source that helps us understand the unknown source. And that's kind of the value of metaphor. It gives words to abstract ideas. So embodied conceptual metaphor is where embodied refers to the idea that cognition and communication form by physical experience and bodily interactions with a tangible world, as well as giving shape to thoughts and feelings. So if you don't know what cancer's like, you don't have anything to reference. And so we give these references, like fighting or journey, to try to make sense of it. But as previously stated, cancer is largely unknown, even to our best minds. So what do we do with that? Virtual reality can visualize abstract ideas. It can visualize metaphors. It can provide alternative metaphors. It can help distance patients from their cancer and help them regain control over their cancer. And again, this is in concert with other therapies. Of course, I would advocate for doing your treatment and receiving counseling and having family support, but this is another way of specifically targeting psychological distress. Now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a game called Chemo by On Comfort. Oops.
This is just so mesmerizing what I'm looking at in 3D. You just want to keep looking at what's around you and all these what are these things that are coming towards me? These like little bugs, insects, and very three-dimensional.
Those are the bad blood cells, and so it's a
okay. I can see that.
Yeah, it's a completely immersive game, and you can kill the bad blood cells.
Am I inside?
So that they were featured on. They had Shark Tank people involved. I don't know if they're actually featured on the show or not, but this is a Houston-based company. And they primarily focus at adolescents, but they do other type of games as well. And this is likely the only metaphorical VR game that is designed specifically to reduce distress in cancer patients. And it's focused at children, which is a significantly small portion of those that are diagnosed with cancer. I believe the marker is about 34 years, 34 years and over. It's about 96% of the population of those cancer patients, and 4% is anybody under 34 years old. Just as a side note, when we're talking about VR games, but often people think about these games only for children, but the research has been used with all ages. So, but On Comfort won the 2016 Astellas Oncology C3 Grand Prize for $50,000 to continue their research, and they have some cool projects. Chemo is a first person, as we saw, it's a, let's see. It's a first person shooter game.
Mesmerizing what I'm looking at in 3D.
That teaches adolescent patients about chemotherapy.
Looking at what's around you and all these, what are these things that are coming?
What's interesting is they got $50,000 with this game, but that's another conversation. But because it's not very complex. So, anyways, so Dr. Susan Schneider is a professor at Duke, and she is the authority in this subject matter. And she said that she's an associate professor at Duke University School of Nursing and an oncology nurse with 30 years of experience. And she said in one of her 9 articles on the subject, by decreasing chemotherapy-related symptoms like anxiety, virtual reality has the potential to increase compliance with treatment, affect survival. That's a pretty heavy phrase right there if you consider what the National Cancer Institute said. It can affect survival and enhance quality of life. And in an interview that I conducted with Dr. Schneider, she compared VR headsets to horse blinders because it just blocks out all visual stressors. And this is one of the real values of virtual reality that distinguishes it from other forms of media with cancer patients. And there'll be a scenario video that I'll give you so these VR games are often used in infusion clinics where a person can be there for 30 minutes. They can be there for 8 hours. And interestingly, Dr. Schneider observed that nobody was really reading books, that it was kind of taxing to do that. They play simple games or just chat or doze off. So you're sitting in a chair and you're plugged into the IV drip. And you've got a lot of time, and you've got a lot of anxiety. And this is an opportunity to lighten the burden on mind by taking them as far away as possible from their experience. So horse blinder isn't a great metaphor, but it's getting us there. So then, let's see. Okay, she isn't alone though in this thought. A 2016 mini review examined the use of VR with 839 patients. This was 19 articles over the span of, I think, dating back to 1999. So this isn't all in one setting, but dating back to 1999, 839 patients, and this mini review collected all the articles and summarized them, and they found that VR improves patients' emotional well-being, and it diminishes cancer-related psychological symptoms. Interestingly though, this mini review makes no mention of what the viewer is seeing. Like, is that unsettling to you all? Like, that this thing does these, it reduces all these psychological symptoms, but they're not talking about what was being seen. Shockingly, one of the games that I read in another publication, I had to look up what the game was about. It was described as a horror mystery game, which to me doesn't seem on brand for reducing psychological distress. So this is clearly, I'm sure you'll agree with me, this is an oversight in academia. So missing from this research, the current academic research, is critical evaluation of the qualities of visual, auditory, and interactive stimuli most likely to reduce negative cancer-related psychological distress. In this article, I'll show you some of my response to this article in a moment, but this played a pretty big role. It was, they gave arts and crafts supplies to patients and asked them to make their tumor or their cancer. And they examined the color, the form and shape, the consistency, the textures, the size, and this was a big influence on me. And so in addition to the visual, auditory, and interactive qualities of cancer, we're also left with a question about the user. Because a lot of people ask me, one of the immediate response usually is, well, like, I get that kids can do it, but what about somebody in their 80s? And right now, the mini review shows that that wasn't a problem. It was used with lots of people of older age that aren't maybe familiar with virtual reality. I don't know, but it was used with them and they had good results. So we have to ask ourselves about, rather than approaching the game like chemo did, where you're a bit of chemotherapy in the bloodstream, shooting bad cells and saving good cells, we kind of have to ask ourselves, what is it that the patient wants? So I would say that missing from the current academic research is a critical evaluation of the patient's source of distress, their source of comfort, the metaphors they use to describe their experience with cancer, and how that can inform the plot and entities of a serious VR game. And here, I won't go through the whole thing, but here's a breakdown, and this second to last row is some of the concepts that I came up with, but this was built off of a peer-reviewed academic research paper that discussed the sources of distress, the sources of comfort, and the metaphors used by cancer patients. They were all in their 70s, and they all had fairly serious situations. They were all hospitalized. But what I did was, in the top row, you have all their sources of distress. So one of them, interestingly, didn't like playing the sick role. She talked about how I don't play the sick role. The only child that she had in the hospital was when London was being bombed by the Nazis. Like, that's the only time that she had a kid in the hospital. So, like, she considered herself tough as a leather boot, you know, and so she felt really distressed to be in the hospital. Another patient really focused on, like, incongruency and irregular, like, non-chronological stories. For her, a sense of order was really important. And then one patient talked about continued confinement, that she was afraid that she was just going to be stuck in the hospital forever. So we have here sources of distress, and then in the purple is their what they found comforting. And like I mentioned, the toughness, the rational chronology, living a simple life. One of the patients felt like cancer was very complex, which it is. And she found comfort in desiring a simple life. And I would say flying through a fake blood vein, shooting fictitious cancer cells isn't that simple. And so what I'm trying to build to is my concepts I built off of their sources of distress and sources of comfort. Here we have the pinks, some metaphors they used, and now we start getting into game plot recommendations in the green. And then the more grass green is things that are specific only to VR, that bring it from a game in any media to a specific VR game. Then I work into the concepts, and we'll get to those here. So this is my kind of giving you a scenario of the way it can be used and some concepts, as well as how I think that cancer could be visualized. Helping cancer patients reduce psychological distress with embodied conceptual metaphors.
You hear that all right?
Serious VR.
Will the treatment work? Take you something to deserve this.
Will it live a long life?
Who will take care of the cancer come back?
Why me?
Fearing the unknown is a source of psychological distress for cancer patients. Concept 1, breaking out the hospital and into nature. In concept 1, the patient is in a familiar hospital setting that is dark and depressing. This concept embodies the experience of the user as a powerful entity that can move freely. Concept 2 and 3, cancer as an obstacle the patient can control and the patient as caregiver. This concept explores the metaphor of cancer as an obstacle on life's journey. Here the user finds that a cancer-like obstacle is blocking the flow of water, consequently making the river stagnate. The user can remove the obstacle, thus restoring order to the virtual world. How might cancer be metaphorically represented in a virtual environment? Cancer is more warm and dark than cool and light. Cancer is more brown than angular. Cancer is more irregular than regular. Cancer is more impinged than unimpinged. Cancer is more soft than hard. And finally, cancer is more small than large. So at the beginning, you were able to see the infusion clinic that I was describing. Helping cancer patients. Where you have a lot of idle time while you're plugged in. And I think this is the best place for this type of intervention. But it includes some limitations in that case, where you're tethered into an IV pole. So, and I should back up and say the mini review with the 19 articles and 839 people, probably about 13 of those were done during chemotherapy infusion. So it's been tested in those environments. But you're not going to want to move a lot. It will really limit how much of the game you develop. You know, it's mainly the 180-degree look. As well as, like, one important thing I think is like undemanding tasks. Something that isn't, you know, kind of unlike a lot of games where it's not terribly hard and it's kind of peaceful and you might get lost in it. Has anybody played the game Journey on PS? Yeah, it's great. I think it's a great template for what this type of game could be someday. And that was an inspiration for my research as well. But this is all that I have, and I really appreciate y'all's time. Was there any question or discussion? Yeah.
So, have you thought about nesting?
I'm sorry.
Have you thought about eye tracking in that sense?
Yeah, I think this would be important, and it's also something that Dr. Susan Schneider brought up, in that one of the big hindrances she saw, in addition to the cost, was not being able to just quickly scan and see the patient's eyes. And so, you know, is there a way to bring in eyesight, but also the way you're bringing up eye tracking is, are you talking about like where they look on the screen, or they can move, that's how they can move?
It's more of a mechanics thing. I mean, that's up to the developer. But using eye tracking, so
Yeah, I think that would be exciting and definitely something worth research. I don't have anything written on it or prepared on it, but that would definitely be, I think,
From Microsoft, I didn't know. Microsoft, you know, all my students, they have applications where you're tracking this, or you're tracking iTrack as well. I don't know how in depth it is, but I actually, Microsoft here, that's on the product, so these applications.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, anything that could like, because the papers addressed nausea, which is like cyber sickness, which is another common concern. They concluded that there wasn't anything. They didn't have a lot of evidence that the patients were experiencing cyber sickness, but it also seems like they didn't dig into it too much. And I would wonder if this, with eye tracking, if that would be a way of reducing that kind of sickness you can get early from moving your head around, because these people are often already feeling pretty gross. So anything that we can prevent them from, moving around too quickly would be good. There's the people that made Journey also came out with a VR game recently. The Journey's In, or not, Lands In, I think is what it is. I don't know if anybody's played that. But they do a nice job of those gaze-based transitions. But
I guess it's like, but if you have examples of different, emotions that patients will feel, or they may want to feel, or trying to avoid, if maybe the patient is trying to feel triumphant over something, let's say against himself or small task, if from a game design perspective, or all the perspective, if they are trying to triumph in something, but you're limited in what you're doing, I guess, it's kind of hard to feel that you're trying. Because otherwise, you're basically watching something,
yeah,
and it's not engaging the player.
yeah,
So, but it's still online because again, you're limited on emotion, you're limited on as far as what the user can do. So, I guess that's online.
yeah. I mean, and it's like a huge demographic and clearly lucrative, so I think that there needs to be more research into it. And of course, when they're not in the infusion clinic, at home, they would have opportunity, because a pretty common thing that patients experience among lots of other side effects is insomnia. So, being able to pop on a headset and having a little more freedom when you're at home, assuming that the patient doesn't have any physical limitations, you would be able to move around more freely, so that if games could be flexible in that respect, I think would be worth researching. Anything else? Well, thank you all so much. I appreciate this.